The lobby of the precinct was built for endurance, not comfort. The walls were paneled in a dull municipal beige, designed less to soothe than to neutralize. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, their steady hum mingling with the faint metallic whir of the vending machine in the corner. The air smelled faintly of bleach, as though every surface had been stripped of human presence, leaving behind only the echo of procedure. Polished floors stretched across the room, hard and reflective, turning footsteps into sharp declarations. Each officer who passed left behind the clipped rhythm of authority, heels on tile, keys brushing belts, radios murmuring half-heard codes. No one lingered. They moved with the efficiency of people who belonged, who never questioned their right to occupy the space. Tasha Williams did not move like them. She entered quietly, carrying no authority on her hip, no radio at her shoulder. She came only with a folder clutched under her arm, its paper edges already frayed from her grip. The folder was not heavy, but the act of carrying it into this place gave it weight. She stepped onto the shining floor, and immediately the light swallowed her, fluorescent and unyielding. The desk at the far end divided the room, a glass partition separating citizens from the machinery of order. Behind the desk sat a clerk in uniform, face lit by the blue glow of a monitor. The clerk's eyes flicked up just long enough to confirm Tasha's existence, then back down, leaving her stranded in that half-space between acknowledgement and dismissal. There were chairs along the wall lined up in obedient rows. Tasha took one. The cushion gave slightly, but the metal frame was cold against her back. She sat straight, her folder resting on her lap, her hands folded over it as though it might be taken from her if she let go. Across from her, above the desk, hung a single-framed emblem, the shield of the department polished under glass, a badge larger than life. The badge caught the fluorescent light in a way no other object in the room did. Every time someone walked past, its edges gleamed, a sharp glint that pierced through the monotony of beige. It did not merely reflect the light. It bent it, controlled it. Tasha watched it, the way it hung suspended, authoritative, untouchable. She knew the same symbol sat pinned to every chest that walked past her, smaller but no less heavy with meaning. The waiting was deliberate. It always was. The institution required waiting, demanded it as proof of hierarchy. To sit under its lights and its chairs was to be reminded that time here was not hers to claim. She glanced at the clock on the far wall, black hands ticking against white, and felt the minutes lengthen. Silence was not absence but presence. It pressed against her, the hush of fluorescent hums and shuffling papers insisting that she remain small, patient, grateful to even be acknowledged. Two officers entered the lobby, mid-conversation. Their voices carried easily across the polished surfaces. They spoke of weekend shifts, of sports scores, of things that carried no weight outside their camaraderie. Yet as they laughed, the sound settled in the room like a coded reminder. This was their domain, their belonging. Neither man looked at her directly, but both registered her presence in the subtle shift of their shoulders as they passed. To see her was unnecessary. To feel her waiting was sufficient. She adjusted her folder slightly, the paper rustling under her fingers. Her reflection on the floor looked back at her in fragments distorted by the polish, as though even her image did not fully belong. She held her posture, chin lifted, though her pulse marked the minutes louder than the clock did. The vending machine hummed. Someone dropped coins into it, a clatter of metal against metal. The sound broke the stillness briefly, then vanished, leaving behind again the endless fluorescent silence. Her eyes returned to the badge on the wall. It gleamed as though it watched her back, a simple piece of metal enlarged and enshrined, but its power was not in its shape. It was in what it allowed, what it excused, what it protected. She thought of the stories folded within her file, names, dates, reports half-written and quickly buried. She thought of the badge stamped at the top of each page, its symbol sealing silence into the margins. She straightened further, refusing to fold into the chair. If the badge was a claim, her posture was its counterclaim. At last the clerk's voice carried across the partition. Flat, efficient, unembellished. Williams? Tasha Williams? She rose, her name cutting through the room like a summons. Every movement she made now felt measured against the silence. She walked toward the desk, the folder pressed against her side, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The clerk did not look up as he gestured toward a side door. Through the narrow opening, the corridor stretched ahead, narrower, darker, lined with closed doors. The hum of fluorescent lights followed her inside, unbroken, inescapable. Her own footsteps sounded louder now, unaccompanied, each one marking her progress deeper into the building's interior. At the end of the hall waited a door already open. A man in uniform stood there leaning against the frame, his badge glinting once more in the light. He said nothing. He did not need to. His eyes scanned her with the casual assessment of someone who had already decided who she was. He stepped aside, a gesture that was both permission and command. The room behind him was small, bare, its furniture reduced to essentials. A table, 2 chairs, a file cabinet against the wall. No windows. The fluorescent hum seemed louder here, compressed by the walls. Tasha crossed the threshold. The officer closed the door behind her with a quiet click, sealing the silence in with them. The badge on his chest caught the light again as he sat, and the room waited. The room was a box. 4 walls, 1 table, 2 chairs. Fluorescent light dripped down in pale, unflattering sheets, bleaching every surface until color itself seemed erased. No windows, no clock, no softness. It was a room built for control, not conversation. The officer took his seat with mechanical certainty. His movements were deliberate, measured like a drill practiced too many times. He leaned back just enough to suggest dominance, yet kept both boots anchored to the floor, as if reminding her whose ground she had entered. His badge gleamed once more, catching the overhead light like a blade drawn halfway. Tasha sat opposite him. Her folder rested neatly on the table's surface, but her hands stayed folded in her lap, a refusal to surrender her body to the table's authority. She held herself still, spine straight, her gaze steady on the man across from her. He began without greeting. "Name?" She answered, calm, unwavering. "Tasha Williams." His pen hovered above a blank form but did not move. His eyes flicked up, scanning her, dissecting rather than listening. He asked another question, voice clipped, each word delivered like a command. She answered, again without flinch, her tone neither submissive nor defiant, only exact. With each response, his jaw tightened. The cadence of his questions quickened, his tone edged with disdain, as though her clarity itself was insolence. He leaned forward, elbows planting onto the table, closing the space between them. His shadow stretched across the table's surface, swallowing the folder she had carried so carefully. "You think you can walk in here and tell us how to do our job?" His voice carried weight not from volume but from disdain, the kind that strips humanity from the air. Tasha did not lower her gaze. "I came to ask why your officers—" "Watch your tone." The interruption cut across her words like a blade. She paused, then continued, slower this time. "Deliberate. Why your officers treated me as if I were already guilty." The silence after was brief, sharp. The room itself seemed to contract around the table, narrowing the space until there was only the distance between his anger and her resolve. His hand twitched. Not a nervous movement, but a calculation. The fingers curled, then relaxed, then curled again, a rhythm that betrayed the pressure building beneath his control. Tasha noticed but did not shift. Her posture remained upright, her breath even, her eyes fixed. He leaned closer. His voice dropped low, carrying more threat in its quietness than in any shout. "You people always want to play the victim." The table became a barrier and a stage, dividing them yet holding their confrontation in its center like evidence. His hands pressed flat against the surface, spreading wide, claiming territory. Hers remained in her lap, still dignified, refusing to perform the submission he sought. The tension broke in an instant. His hand rose, swift and deliberate, cutting through the space between them. It was not the fumbling of passion, but the execution of a decision. Flesh met flesh with a sound that echoed sharper than any word spoken before. The strike landed across her face. Her head jerked slightly with the force, but her body did not fall. The sound hung in the room, louder than the fluorescent hum, louder than the scrape of the chair beneath him. The silence that followed was not empty but thunderous, pressing into every corner of the small box until even the officer seemed to feel its weight. Tasha sat still. The red bloom spread across her cheek, hot and immediate, but her posture did not collapse. She held herself upright, spine rigid, hands still folded in her lap. Her gaze, when it returned to his, carried no collapse, no concession. He waited for something. A cry, a protest, a collapse into the role he had written for her. Nothing came. The table between them became a witness. It had received the sound of the strike, absorbed the vibrations of his hand against the air, yet remained as it was. Cold, unmoving, impartial. The line dividing them had not shifted. His breathing grew heavier, though he tried to mask it. The strike had been meant to end the moment, to re-establish control. Instead, it had created a silence so absolute it accused him more than her words ever could. Tasha did not raise a hand to her face. She did not lower her eyes. She sat as though rooted, her very stillness a defiance louder than any shout. The officer shifted in his chair, the scrape of metal against tile breaking the suffocating silence. His hand, the one that struck, flexed unconsciously. The skin reddened across the knuckles. He looked at her, then away, then back again, as though searching for the collapse that had not come. The hum of the lights filled the space again, a constant reminder of the system that surrounded them. Impersonal, mechanical, unblinking, and still she sat upright, her dignity intact. The sound of the strike lingered long after it had fallen. It was no longer just in her skin, but in the walls, in the air, in the silence that thickened until it felt almost material. The fluorescent hum receded beneath it, the chair legs, the table edges. Everything seemed to hold the echo of violence. Tasha did not move. The red heat spread across her cheek, but her spine remained straight, her hand still folded neatly in her lap. Her silence was not submission but indictment. She let it sit there, heavy, unbroken, until the officer's own breathing betrayed his unease. And then she spoke. Her voice was calm, even, each word measured, falling into the silence like stone into water, leaving ripples that spread outward. You struck me, not because I threatened you, not because I disobeyed, but because I reminded you of something you already know. He shifted in his chair, the scrape of metal on tile clumsy now, no longer deliberate. You know your authority doesn't rest on truth, she continued. It rests on fear. Fear is the currency this badge trades in. You didn't strike me to enforce the law. You struck me because you needed proof. I'm proof that I could still be made small. Her eyes held his, unwavering. The heat in her cheek pulsed, but her voice did not break. You failed. The words landed sharper than his hand had. The clock on the wall ticked, steady, mechanical. Each second stretched, defined by the rhythm of her speech. She allowed the silence between phrases to linger long enough to make him feel it, to let the weight of her words spread wider than the room. You struck me because you are weak. Because the system you serve is weak. It needs men like you, and fists, walls, lights, locked doors conduit to hide its hollowness. But weakness always reveals itself. Violence is its confession. His posture began to crumble. Where before he leaned forward, claiming space, now his shoulders curled slightly inward. He tapped his pen against the form before him, though no words had been written. Each tap landed out of rhythm with the clock, a nervous percussion against her measured cadence. Tasha leaned forward, closing the space he had once claimed. Her voice remained low, but it filled the room entirely. You thought this strike would silence me, but all it did was expose you. The moment your hand rose, you admitted the truth. You had no argument left. Only violence. The silence stretched again. She allowed it, let it grow unbearable until even the lights seemed to dim beneath it. The badge you wear, her gaze flicked down to the metal gleam pinned at his chest, was meant to stand for service, protection, integrity. But today it only stands for your failure, and every second you sit here you prove it again. The officer's breathing thickened. He shifted again, legs spreading wider, chest lifting as though to reassert size, presence, command. But the more he moved, the smaller he seemed against her stillness. Tasha remained unshaken. Her words came again, steady and sharp. This room is your stage. This table is your shield, and still you had to strike. That's all anyone will remember. Not my words, not your questions. The sound of your hand and the fact that I did not fall. Her cheek still burned, but she made no move to touch it. The refusal was deliberate, proof that the pain was not hers to carry, but his to answer for. The clock ticked again. A full minute gone, she leaned back now, not retreating but reclaiming the space. 3 minutes. That's all it takes for the truth to show itself. In 3 minutes, I don't have to raise my voice. I don't have to leave this chair. I don't even have to move. I only have to let you reveal yourself. Her eyes locked onto his once more. And you just did. He tried to meet her gaze, but it faltered. His eyes slid briefly to the door, then to the table, then back again. The certainty in his posture was dissolving. The silence between them became unbearable, not for her, but for him. Second minute gone. Tasha's voice softened, but the precision cut deeper than force could. You are not the first man to believe violence gives him authority. You won't be the last, but every blow exposes what the badge cannot cover. Every strike makes the system weaker, not stronger. And the weakness is not mine. It is yours. Her words did not rise, did not rush. They simply landed one after another, unrelenting. The officer's pen slipped from his hand and rolled across the table, striking the edge before falling to the floor. The sound was small, but in the silence it cracked through the room like an admission. Third minute gone. Tasha spoke once more, her voice final, certain. You struck me. And now the truth is written on you, not me. The truth of fear, of weakness, of a system too fragile to withstand questions. I will carry this mark on my face tonight. You will carry it on your conscience forever. The clock ticked again. The silence that followed was total. The door opened with a muted click, the sound too small for the weight it carried. For a moment the room's silence clung to Tasha like a second skin. Even as the hall stretched before her, she stepped out, her cheek still flushed from the officer's hand. The red mark undeniable, sharp against the sterile light. The corridor was narrow, lined with closed doors, some left ajar just enough to suggest listening. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in an unbroken line, pulling the space forward like a conveyor belt. Her footsteps struck the tile with measured cadence, each one louder than it should have been. The air shifted as she entered it. Officers stationed at desks along the wall looked up, some too quickly, some too slowly. A few eyes locked on her cheek before darting away, as though the mark itself was contagious. Others lingered, staring longer than decency allowed, their silence more damning than words could ever be. None spoke. Word traveled differently here. It was not carried in sentences but in glances, posture, the subtle tightening of a jaw, the sudden stillness of a hand hovering above paperwork. The story of what had happened behind the closed door was already spreading, moving through the building like static, invisible but charged. She walked steadily. The folder was still under her arm, its weight unchanged, but her body felt heavier now, every step insisting on dignity. She refused to quicken her pace, refused to acknowledge the eyes that followed her. The corridor had been designed for efficiency. File cabinets pushed against walls, plastic chairs for waiting, bulletin boards cluttered with notices no one read. But now it was transformed. It became a stage, its audience unwilling, pressed into judgment by her passage. Each closed door became a jury box, each open one a witness stand. She passed two officers who stood in quiet conversation. Their voices stopped mid-sentence as she approached. One turned his back deliberately, eyes fixed on the bulletin board as if reading something urgent. The other let his gaze follow her, unblinking, his expression unreadable but heavy with the knowledge of what silence costs. The mark on her cheek glowed brighter under the fluorescent wash, a living testament. No badge, no report, no denial could erase it. It said what no words needed to, that violence had already entered the record written onto her skin. A door creaked open just ahead. A sergeant stepped out, papers in hand, his brow furrowed at the sound of her footsteps. He looked at her, then at the flush across her face. His mouth opened, closed again. The papers crumpled slightly in his grip. Without a word, he stepped back into his office, closing the door softly but firmly, sealing himself away from the judgment the corridor demanded. She walked on. Her footsteps echoed louder now, not because she had quickened, but because the silence had grown deeper. Every movement she made expanded outward, magnified against the sterile walls. She became both presence and accusation, the silence of others serving as unwilling testimony. At the far end of the hall, a group of officers lingered near the exit. Their voices were low, laughter muffled by the weight of her approach. One by one, they grew quiet as they noticed her. Their eyes moved from her gaze to her cheek and back again. None smiled. None laughed. The hallway seemed to contract, narrowing around her as though the building itself recognized the fracture spreading within its walls. The institution strained to contain it. The silence, the diverted gazes, the doors closing, all attempts to seal away the moment, to bury it under the weight of procedure and routine. Yet the fracture remained, visible not in words but in avoidance, in the discomfort etched into every posture she passed. She reached the corridor's midpoint and paused briefly, Not to rest, but to let the silence expand further. Her chin lifted, her gaze unbroken. She made no move to cover her cheek, no attempt to soften its truth. Instead, she carried it openly as one carries evidence into a courtroom, and the corridor was the jury. They would not absolve her. They would not absolve him. They would not absolve themselves. Their silence was a verdict, not of justice, but of complicity. She resumed her walk, her steps unhurried, deliberate, echoing against the tile with the rhythm of a gavel falling again and again. Each impact said what no voice in the hall dared to say aloud, that the system was watching itself and finding itself guilty. By the time she reached the exit, the corridor behind her was no longer neutral space. It had become a record, each silence a line inscribed, each glance a witness statement. Nothing had been written down, but everything had been seen, and nothing unseen could be forgotten. The precinct doors released her with a hiss of hydraulics, as though reluctant to let her go. She stepped out into the city's air, cooler, restless, filled with the hum of traffic and the shuffle of lives moving in every direction. The fluorescent sterility of the corridors fell away behind her, replaced by the unpredictable rhythm of the street, horns, footsteps, the low murmur of engines idling at red lights. Above her, the skyscrapers stood indifferent, their mirrored windows catching the late light and scattering it across the avenues. Glass and steel rose in rigid lines, monuments to commerce and order, yet they looked down on her with the same vacancy as the badge on the wall inside. The city breathed unbothered, but it carried her steps forward. Tasha did not quicken. She walked at the same measured pace that had carried her through the corridor of witnesses. Her cheek still bore the mark, faintly swelling now, but she made no move to hide it. Under the open sky, the mark became less a wound than a banner. The air cooled its heat, yet its presence deepened. Pedestrians passed without pause. A woman with shopping bags glanced at her, then away. A man in a business suit checked his watch as he brushed past. None knew the strike, the silence, the 3 minutes of dismantling that had occurred just beyond those glass doors. But the city absorbed her all the same, as though carrying her forward into a wider testimony. She paused at the crosswalk. The traffic light shifted from green to yellow to red, a mechanical cycle indifferent to her presence. Yet in its rhythm, she felt the resonance of her words, measured, unyielding, impossible to stop once begun. She waited upright as cars idled in compliance with the red glow. The mark on her face reflected faintly in the glass of a bus window as it passed, a fleeting reminder that truth could ride unnoticed through the streets, visible yet unseen. Behind her, the precinct loomed. Its brick and concrete exterior carried no sign of what had transpired within, no crack to suggest fracture. Yet she knew the silence inside was unsettled, that the corridor still held the imprint of her footsteps, that the officer's hand still flexed against the memory of its strike. The building itself seemed to press outward, trying to contain the moment, but its walls were porous. What had been spoken could not be sealed back inside. She crossed when the signal allowed, her stride steady, her gaze forward. In the distance, a church bell rang the hour. Its toll echoed between the towers, mixing with the clatter of traffic and the hiss of brakes. Time moved on, relentless, but her 3 minutes stretched beyond its measure. The bell was not a call to worship, but a reminder that moments expand when they bear the weight of truth. The badge returned to her mind, not the one on the wall, not the one on the officer's chest, but the idea of it, the symbol itself, once polished, authoritative, unquestionable, now fractured. Every glint of sunlight off metal surfaces around her, a car hood, a street sign, a lamppost, reminded her of its lost shine. Legitimacy could not be restored by polish. Authority could not be repaired by silence. The city continued its business. Children tugged on parents' hands. Vendors shouted prices from food carts. A cyclist rang a bell impatiently as he wove through pedestrians. Life flowed, indifferent. But within its indifference lay possibility. The truth she carried was not erased by the city's movement. It was amplified, scattered into the open air where walls could not contain it. She reached a plaza where glass towers gave way to an open stretch of sky. The sun had begun its descent, the light shifting softer, deeper, pulling long shadows across the ground. She stood still for a moment, letting the breeze move against her skin, letting the sky wash over her. Here the fluorescent hum was gone. Here the silence was not imposed but chosen. She closed her eyes briefly, Not to retreat, but to anchor. The mark on her cheek pulsed with her heartbeat, insistent, undeniable. She opened her eyes again and lifted her chin higher. This was no longer about one officer, one strike, one room. It was about the system that had shaped him, that had given him the badge, the table, the silence of colleagues who turned their eyes away. It was about the institution that demanded submission in exchange for order, silence in exchange for safety. Her refusal had broken that exchange. 3 minutes. That was all it had taken. 3 minutes to unmask weakness, to fracture the shield of legitimacy, to turn violence into confession. And now those 3 minutes lived not just in her, but in every witness who had averted their eyes, in every officer who had stood in the corridor, in the silence that had followed her steps. The city would not record it in its newspapers. The building would not release a statement. The badge would still gleam tomorrow, but the crack was there, spreading, invisible yet irreparable. Tasha began to walk again, moving further from the precinct, deeper into the city's flow. Her footsteps no longer echoed off sterile tile, but merged with the countless others moving across concrete and asphalt. Yet they carried the same weight, the same cadence, deliberate, unbroken, undeniable. Above her, the sky shifted from pale blue to gold, light bending against glass towers, refracting into fragments. The fractured glow mirrored the fractured badge in her mind, a symbol no longer whole, no longer unquestioned. And as the city swallowed her into its endless movement, the truth remained. Her dignity intact, the system exposed, the silence forever changed.